Good morning. I thought I'd give a little talk on why I gave up using modelers. You're looking at me thinking this guy is older than God. Of course he doesn't use modelers. He's tube amps forever. He hates modelers. He's never used them, and that's absolutely the opposite of the truth. I've been an early adopter of technology since the early 80s when I was using a digital effects switcher and digital delays and digital reverbs in racks, playing little places like CBGB's and TR3 and the Danceteria and the Dive, at a time when most bands that were kitted out with that kind of gear were, touring internationally. I have been an early adopter of technology all along, and I've had some fairly ludicrous large setups. I had one setup with multiple racks that were joined together with mil-spec multi-pin connectors and just complete insanity. I had kind of pretty much like a recording studio in a rack with tons of aux sends and effects loops and just insanity. So by the time I heard of the Axe-Fx, the Axe-Fx Ultra had just come out, and they had a 30-day money-back guarantee, so I bought one. And I found it to be the warmest, most lush, rich, creamy, smooth, digital sound I'd ever heard. I was blown away by the Axe-Fx, and took apart my rig and replaced it with an Axe-Fx Ultra and a power amp and a looper, a boomerang looper, a rain mixer, because I always have put my voice and viola and guitar through my effects, and a PCM70, because there are things the PCM70 can do that nothing else can do. And in fact, someday when I do an episode on my current pedal board, which is humongous, I will talk about how I'm using about 7 effects to try to do what a PCM70 does with one particular, I think it's a 7-tap flanged delay, and nothing can touch it. And the PCM70 reverb is also gorgeous. So at any rate, that was my performing and recording rig. And like many early adopters of this technology, we had the lovely situation with recording engineers in studios and front of house engineers wanting to mic my FR speaker. FR is full range flat response, and when you are using cabinet emulation, cab IRs, impulse response files, you typically go through an FR speaker, and there's no point in miking that speaker because what is coming out of the Axe-Fx via its cables is the same. So it was very funny in the first couple of years. You'd have these arguments both at gigs and at recording studios. No, don't mic anything. Just take this to the board and then send it through the monitors. Gradually, that became acceptable, but it was quite comical. I was recording an album in 2015, and the engineer insisted on miking the cabinet the first couple of times, which was I still have it. It's an Atomic Neo Wedge, I believe, active speaker. Eventually, I was like, look, go ahead and mic it up. Now, take an XLR out the back of my rack and compare the two. And from that point on, he stopped forcing us to wait while he mic'd up my cabinet. I have tried my Axe-Fx Ultra. I tried it with a rack-mounted power amp or two, different types of power amps, and FRF speakers using the Axis cabinet emulations, their IRs. I've used it with those rack mount amps into guitar cabs, and eventually I went to the Atomic Wedge, which I love, which I will also talk about at some point, do a review of. I have tortured that poor thing, and it's still amazing. So that's an active speaker, FR speaker with a built-in amp. So I used all those, and I upgraded from the Ultra to the 2, and that was my gig rig, and that was my recording rig, and I had all the benefits of a modeler, tons of effects, most of which were very good. I can't say all of them were good, but most of them were very good, and of course tons of amps and cabinets and microphones, great. So I was very active in the Axe-Fx Fractal community. which by itself was very interesting because we sometimes got into political discussions and people would send anonymous notes to my website, not knowing that my form actually trapped their IP addresses, which I never did anything about. But I basically had sort of like Klansmen writing me saying, yeah, we're going to kill all you Jews when the revolution comes, and all you liberal scum are going to die. So anyone thinks that music's the universal language and it will cause peace around the world, yeah, I got news for you. Not necessarily. I also met a lot of great people on the Fractal community. But one of the things that I had suggested for years on the Fractal community was a guitar page on the Axe-Fx. So you could set up each of your guitars to have a basic gain level and a basic EQ curve. Why is this important? Because in the middle of a gig, my Strat goes to hell, or I take my Strat out of the case and the string tree is gone, and I need to use, my SG. All right. Of course, I don't want to go into every one of my patches and change stuff because I've changed guitars. I want a little front end that goes, okay, we're making this adjustment for your guitars. I thought this was an eminently practical and almost necessary thing to add to the Axe-Fx, and they never did, at least not while I was using one. But that begged a larger question, which is, if it's that hard to make a change in a live gig, is that really what you want? With my old pedal boards, I needed more distortion or more gain. I went and I twiddled a knob, and that was it. There's a little bit of that on the Axe-Fx. You can do some very basic stuff without going into the menus, but if you want to go any deeper, you want to add more distortion today because, I don't know, somebody else in the band has more or something, it's a pain in the ass. And that begs an even larger question, which is, I saw a lot of guys on the Fractal site who seem to spend more time obsessively twiddling and tweaking than actually playing music. And there was a time in my life where I was a super avid tweaker, and I still have a proclivity for it, but I got less interested in that. And more to the point, I got less interested in tweaking. Well, first of all, you have a law of diminishing returns where you have so many parameters and so many choices and so many variables and maybe 30 different ways of getting close to point B from point A. It gets ridiculous. You almost get frozen by the extravaganza of options and possibilities you have. But beyond that, it's all done via menus and menus and menus and menus and menus. And that is a crappy user interface. My old Memory Man digital delay, it's like you got a couple of knobs and you go, oh, I want it to modulate more. I want to change the wet-dry mix, whatever. You just did it. My current pedal board has a whole bunch of cute little lights and knobs that I can twiddle to my heart's content. Some of these devices are digital, which means that you can press knobs and go into menus, which makes them more complex. It means there is more hidden under the hood. It means the interface is more complicated. But for basic on the fly or basic messing around in the studio, coming up with new sounds interface, it is much, much easier. Go to my synesthesia and go, oh yeah, I want more modulation. Thank you. I want to change the wet dry mix. Go to my Golden Boy and say, I want more grunt. Go to my Big Sky and say, I need a wetter mix, or my Flint, or whatever. That kind of ease of use, that you could say that more analog way of doing things. There's a knob, you turn it, something happens, versus paging into menu 15, parameter 226. So, manipulating nested layers of menus with a few small rotary controls is never going to be as efficient as having a whole bunch of stuff laid out in front of you and going, I want more reverb. It's more natural and it's literally more efficient, except that you've got this giant, in my case, ludicrously giant pedal board to tote around with you. And there is a reason my pedal board is so ludicrous, and I will cover that in another episode. So that was my first problem with modelers, is I just got sick of how much work it sometimes took to do something really trivial. And God forbid you have to change guitars in the middle of a gig, because yeah, every single one of your patches was going to be unhappy with you. Problem number 2 was more interesting. I had in the living room over there a 1965-66 Princeton made of pre-CBS parts. And here I had a big ass heavy Fender Twin, which was my main amp before the Axe-Fx. As I say, I tried all kinds of combinations of using guitar cabs and FR speakers, and even an amazing lightweight speaker made by a company called Art of Noise that weighed like nothing. But I found myself playing my Twin. I could understand playing the Princeton. I'm out there watching a movie and I want to putz around. But here in the studio, when I was playing to play, I wasn't recording, I wasn't working on a patch, I wasn't working on a set, I was just sitting there wanting to play, I'd power up the Twin. And I was like, what's going on here? Why is this happening? I've got this amazing thing with, you know, tons of amps in it and effects and, you know, speakers and stuff that I couldn't dream of owning. Why am I going back to my Twin that I've been playing since the 80s? And I came to the conclusion that there was a sort of oomph in the chest that I got from that I could turn my Axe-Fx up loud, and I could put my atomic wedge up on a chair or slightly up or whatever, so it was even the same height and the same distance from me as my Twin, and it just didn't do it. And is that because of the digital modeling? Is that because of the IRs? I don't know. Is it because of the very microscopic delay? That's what I actually think it is. Except that my pedal board has a bunch of digital stuff in it that's got to be delaying things. But it seemed like there was a layer of immediacy taken away. There was a very tiny layer of immediacy that was just gone. And I've seen lots of interviews with amp designers who talk about the feel factor. And some of these amp designers sell plugins that model their amps. So they're not all like anti-digital, you know, guys with tubes and soldering irons. Not at all. But they all say there's a feel to playing an amp versus a modeler. I'm not going to delve too deeply into the argument between solid-state amps and tube amps. This, to me, is more germane between digital and analog. But I was feeling a kind of very hard to pin down or describe satisfaction after years of playing a modeler. You know, I guess what happened was I went and played at people's houses, and I played some amps in a studio when I was recording an album, and I just sort of started drifting back and finding there was a satisfaction there. There was a little tiny something missing from the modeler. Now, the third problem arises if you are on stage and you are either playing with in-ear monitors, or if you're playing even to a lesser extent with wedges way in front of you. But let's go with in-ear monitors. If I am playing with in-ear monitors, there is no way that that guitar is interacting with the sound of what I'm playing. The audience is getting it, right? There's some big ass PA speakers facing the audience, but I'm not getting it. Normally, I would have something behind me, right? They call it backline for a reason. I'd have an amp, maybe my Twin, maybe on the floor, maybe on a chair, and it would be vibrating like all hell behind me, loud as hell, and vibrating me, and vibrating my guitar, and vibrating the air around my guitar, and the pickups would be interacting with that. And that is gone if you're playing a modeler through in-ear monitors, and you're a modeler, and your modeler is going straight to front of house. It's not going through any kind of FR speaker. That entire interactivity is gone. Now, if you are playing to a monitor wedge that is 5 or 10 feet in front of you, which I've done, which I remember playing a viola solo where I got right up on that wedge and I got some really cool feedback, it definitely can be done. Is it the same as having the amp behind you? Would having my atomic on a chair behind me interact the same as having my Twin on a chair behind me? I don't know. It strikes me that it would be pretty damn similar, right? They're both putting out a lot of sound and vibrating the air. The only difference could be whatever is causing that difference in immediacy. Maybe that microsecond of delay could affect the way I play or affect the way my guitar interacts. Maybe it smears things a little because the way it's responding is being smeared out in time by microseconds. I don't know. But that's the third issue, and that issue is, as I say, particularly pernicious if you're playing with in-ear monitors with no physical speakers, facing you at all. An entire level of what makes playing, loud guitar on stage or loud guitar in your room fun, that interaction is gone. Now, I eventually sold my Axe-Fx 2, and if I had a lot of money, I would probably buy one. It's really useful for recording. It's great to have, a stack of Voxes and Marshalls and blah, blah, blah to play with. My DAW, Samplitude, a pretty uncommon DAW, but I think a DAW that beats the pants off of most of them, has a pretty good guitar rack built into it with decent modeling and effects, and sometimes I use that. And sometimes I play DI in because I want the clear, crystalline, direct tone. But most of the time I'm miking my Blues Deluxe reissue there behind me. I see that modelers are useful. I see that they're probably better for some people. I am not saying tube amps are the only way to go. I'm saying there is a qualitative difference, and maybe it takes somebody who's played a tube amp for 10 years or 20 years or 40 years to feel that difference. But in my case, I was this super enthusiastic, early adopter of modelers, and not super early, the little pods and stuff I couldn't stand. But once the Axe-Fx came out, I was just blown away. I loved it. But between the ease of use of regular pedals and that ineffable boom when I play a guitar amp, I went back to it. And whatever you do, you might love modelers, you might hate them. But for some of us, including quite a few famous musicians who really were enthusiastic about the Axe, quite a few of them have shifted back for similar reasons. The feel, and they're sick of twiddling. They are just sick of 40 layers of menus with 100 parameters on each menu. They're just sick of it. So there are quite a few bands that were very enthusiastic and were endorsers of Axe and were talked up in the Axe community that have quietly left. Now, all of this said, I will also say that the best live guitar sound I have ever heard was Dweezil Zappa playing the Roxy and Elsewhere album, his father, Frank Zappa's Roxy and Elsewhere album in its entirety at a concert that I saw in Poughkeepsie. He was using two Axe-Fx's, I think because he needed two to get some of Frank's sounds, and a more clear but strong and ballsy and just completely coherent and together sound I have never heard before. Frank's sound was never that good. So it can deliver the goods. It's just, so I ain't knocking it. It's just for some of us, it's missing a little tiny something. And that's why I went back to tube amps. I hope you enjoyed this. And if you like my content, please like and subscribe and pass the word to your friends. And until next time, have fun playing and be good to your neighbor. Thanks.